You look as the world turns while your heart burns among machines. You're lost just like everyone is. Only difference is you're on fire. You're on fire. You're on fire. You're on fire. Welcome to Daoism with Ian Felton. As you might have guessed, I'm Ian Felton, and today we're going to talk about Chapter 4 of Daodejing, the classic text of Daoism. If this is your first time listening, I'm a psychotherapist in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I have a small private practice that I'm actually sitting in right now. And Chapter 4 has, and for me it really feels like the first chapter of Daodejing. There's the very first line of Chapter 4 encapsulates this text in two characters, and it's amazing how beautifully done it is. Those two characters could really stand on their own for so much of Tao and the nature of Tao. And what are those two characters? Those two characters are Daochong, which Tao we know as Tao, and Chong is a really pretty character. The left side of the character has the symbol for water, and the right side of the character, it looks like an aperture. And what it really is conveying is that Tao is like this rushing water that comes up through this aperture and rushes forth. And no matter how much rushes forth or how intensely it rushes forth, it can't be exhausted. Tao is this spontaneous expression that can take infinite forms and arises from some mysterious place, from some mysterious aperture. And it aligns with quantum physics. We know that at the quantum level, once you go down through matter into molecules and atoms, and then the atomic particles, beyond that, there's a field that is a mystery. Sound familiar? Just like Chapter 1 of Daodejing that talks about the mystery of Tao, that it's like an abyss. And these quantum particles flash in and out of existence in some multitude of dimensions. And we can think about that as the aperture. So in some ways, those two characters, these first two characters of this chapter, not only does it symbolize intuitively the nature of existence, the ontology of existence, but It also symbolizes what we've discovered through highly sophisticated instruments when studying quantum mechanics, particle physics, and we've kind of reached the limit of what we can see. I mean, there hasn't been any groundbreaking discovery fundamentally for decades and decades and decades when it comes to the nature of the quantum world, and it still supports what was written in these two characters, this rushing forth of infinite forms through an aperture that we can't access. It's still a mystery. So, per usual, let me read this chapter, and then we'll talk about it some more. If you're joining for the first time, you can find a lot of materials at ianfelton.com/podcast. Blog posts have a link to the PDF that I use, and also materials that I put together for each episode. You don't have to follow along with those. It's just there for people who are interested in it. So here is the reading, Chapter 4. 道中而用之或不盈，渊兮四万物之中，错其锐，结其分，和其光，同其前，降兮色若寸，吾不知谁之子，象帝之先。And if you don't understand Chinese, that's fine. I don't read this thinking that people understand Chinese. I read it to show the seriousness that I've taken with understanding this text. So you don't have to understand the Chinese. You just need to sit back and take it in, and hopefully I will read it smoothly enough that you can get a sense of the rhythm of it and the sound of it. So let's look at a translation that I did for this chapter. Dao, fullness surging through dynamic emptiness. But its use doesn't create imbalance. Profoundly deep, as if the ancestor of everything. Rounds sharp edges, resolves disorder, softens brightness, unifies matter, so deep, as if existing, perhaps. I don't know whose child it is. It resembles what preceded the first ordering of things. So some choices that I made with this translation. I've talked a little bit about how Tao arose in a time before Western ideas of morality and heaven and hell and transcendence and all those things, that Tao, as it's described in this book, is describing a process that can be observed. So when I do translations, I'm very careful to not introduce Western concepts that can, in my opinion, detract greatly from the spirit of Taoism, which it's describing this moment that we live in. It's describing not a being that exists in some ethereal realm transcendent of this one, but rather Tao is a process that's present in every moment and also exists in this dark, mysterious place that all forms arise from. You know, the dark matter that we know exists, that we're aware is in the universe, but we can't observe it, we can't see it. But the process of Tao unfolding before us constantly as a process, that is what we're seeing. And this chapter describes how this process works, that if something is too sharp or sharp at all, Tao will blunt it. If something is at any extreme, Tao will bend it back toward its other end of the spectrum. And in this case, we hear about how Tao softens brightness. So when things become extremely bright, Tao will dim them. Think of the sun, and no matter how bright the sun shines, there's a night, there's a life to the brightest star, and eventually it will dim into darkness. And unifies matter. There's a gravity to things. Objects attract other objects, and at the atomic level, the strong nuclear force holds things together. And again, this was written way before there was any sort of modern chemistry or physics, but yet those who partook in organizing the ontology of Taoism, they just sensed it. They could see it. They could see that Tao has these qualities. And this chapter is quite brief and efficient. There's not a lot of length, even in Chinese, compared to the other chapters written in Chinese. This one is quite brief and efficient, yet it says so much about the true nature that even after centuries of scientific observation, this chapter covers a lot of ground. You might have noticed that at the beginning of today's episode, I played a song which I think is going to be the intro for the podcast, and it also touches on an element of the podcast that I want to make sure that I start doing each time. When David and I were doing the podcast, we would have a Tao moment where we would talk about some moment during the week when we felt like we were really connected with Tao, aligned with Tao. And I will say that that is how I felt when that song came out. Just felt that song arise right before this episode, just a couple hours before recording today. I was playing a chord progression, a pretty basic chord progression, and I just started singing some words, and the words came up spontaneously out of the field we call this aperture of Tao. We don't know where it arises from, but it does. And when I was playing, I wasn't thinking, oh, this is going to be the intro for the podcast. So it wasn't some sort of contrived, oh, let me write an intro. It was, I'm just picking on my guitar, and this feeling came up, in the words. You look as the world turns, observing Tao and our society and our modern culture, while your heart burns among machines, that Tao is about aliveness. It's about not tamping down your spirit in an unnatural way. It's about living fully within a society that's about laws, processes, conformity, being shaped by propaganda, peer pressure, advertising, corrupt advertising. I had a conversation with Jonathan, one of the podcast listeners. He's a really interesting guy who lives in China and has a music company there. And we were talking about, I don't even know exactly what I said in the last episode, but I was hitting advertising pretty hard for being really contrived and corrupt. And we were discussing, can advertising be aligned with Tao? And I think it can be, but I've been in Cuba, and it's kind of funny because instead of seeing McDonald's billboards along the highways, you see billboards talking about the revolution and all of the messaging of the revolutionaries. And so in that case, the form is similar to how capitalists use advertising, billboards along the highway, posters, that sort of thing. But the function is the same, which is to have an agenda to make people think a certain way about things, not necessarily for creating harmony, but for the purposes of those in power, whether that's a powerful state or whether they're capitalist oligarchs or neoliberals, whatever. So what would advertising be like when it's aligned with Tao? Well, I mean, it would need to follow Ziran, so sort of a natural flow of things. So it will be about connecting people to each other, connecting people to resources, not for an agenda, but just as an instinctual sort of thing. Like, think about walking on a trail, for example. There's advertising on the trail when you're pointed toward a shelter or the trail markings to let you know that you're on the right path. You could take that as a basic example and then amplify it into even an urban area. We'll get into later chapters about what a Daoist utopia would look like, and it doesn't say much about cities when it paints those pictures, but let's assume that you could still have higher density populations of people living together, but things were still more aligned with Tao. You could have advertising, just like those trail markers, connecting people with resources, connecting people with each other. But what they shouldn't be doing is stimulating people's desires in an un-Daoist way. Taoism, it's about moderation, keeping things humble, but also giving freely. There's an abundance associated with Tao. So it's not about asceticism, like starving yourself or only eating one bowl of rice a day like some religious devotees do in other Eastern ways of living. Tao isn't about that. So yes, I think advertising could be done in a Taoist way, but it would not look like either capitalist or communist advertising. So thank you, Jonathan, for reaching out, and I encourage anyone who's interested in discourse and discussion to send me an email, ian@ianfelton.com. I'm happy to take the time to read what you have to share, any questions you have, and give you a perspective. My views of Taoism have changed a lot over time as I refine my understanding and as I expose myself to other thinkers, students of Tao who have tried to seriously uncover its wisdom. So what I say today might be different if I get asked the same question again, but I'll do my best. So some other things from this chapter, going back to the eminence associated with the philosophy that I try to align with Taoism. What do I mean by eminence? It's that there's nothing transcendental. There's not, Tao isn't some god in the sky. When Tian Xia is used, which is kind of like, it means everything that arises, that exists, where a lot of translations will introduce the concept of heaven, which Tian has a meaning of heaven associated with it in Chinese culture, but it means a lot of different things contextually. And when I translate those words, I make sure that however I use it, it's processual, it's imminent, meaning it can be experienced in this life, not that there's some domain above humanity looking down on us and what we're doing and waiting for us to die so that we can be purified into some angelic beings. There's none of that in the original text. A lot of this stuff has been introduced later on. So if you haven't heard my recommendations from the past, if you want to really dig deeply into the philosophical aspect of it, I recommend you pick up the Hall and Ames version of Daodejing, because they get really deep into why it is a processual understanding and not in an immanent understanding of Tao, and not something transcendental. But for this podcast, I'm going to try not to make it too academic and just try to meet people where they might be, and trying to navigate Taoism within a society. I'm assuming most of the people that listen to this podcast live in a capitalist society. When I look at the statistics, most listeners are in the US, but they're also in a lot of other Western cultures, the UK, Australia, a lot of countries. So thank you all for using whatever platform you're finding the podcast on. I will put a poll on each episode. I do want to try to understand what people appreciate most, so that I can try to keep that in mind when I'm doing these episodes. So far, it seems like everyone's mainly interested in how I'm currently talking about other translations and referencing other translations, but also doing my own and explaining the concepts and connecting it back to daily life, and as a psychotherapist, also psychological health. So that makes me think of, for today, how would chapter 4, how can we bring some psychological health into our lives from chapter 4? The first thing that comes to mind is embracing uncertainty again. That so often in our culture, we want an answer. We want resolution. We want to know. Taoism, frankly, doesn't care about any of that. It states quite clearly, life is a mystery, and there are no ultimate answers, but we can see from living within these processes that there's some observable, I don't want to use the word laws, but the nature of things. So the first thing I would say is embrace uncertainty. We don't know. We don't know. Let's say we truly, truly love someone, and we want to know without a shadow of a doubt that this person loves us back and that they're going to love us forever. And we crave that so badly, but we can never really know that. Those are impossible things to know. And this chapter lets us know that uncertainty is always there, and that change is constant, that Tao is constantly rounding the sharp things, unifying things in its own way, that there's a constant dynamic change and flux to everything in its own way, and it's not predicated upon human wants and desires. That great love will turn into something else. There's no ecstatic moment that we live in where we just continue on in bliss, that the highest high is going to come back down to earth. That's addiction, right? People chasing the high of drugs or adrenaline or whatever it is, that in trying to sustain it, the high has to get higher and higher, and the crash gets bigger and bigger. And that's a lot of what this chapter is saying, that, you know, Tao pulls the highest of highs back down by reversal. And that's also why Taoism leans into moderation, that it's not that you have to deprive yourself of joy or pleasure, but that find a nice baseline, and if you kind of moderate yourself up and down from that baseline without going to extremes, life will be a lot more stable. Life will be a lot more manageable. That makes me think of someone who they tended to, like the billionaire class in a server role, and they're just constantly obsessed with their money. And you would think that once you had $1 billion, that you could just let go of even thinking about money, because you would know, well, I will never run out of money, and there is nothing that I cannot have that I want, whether it's a ridiculously luxurious mansion or maybe even a small private island, whatever. But that what they noticed was that the people with the most money, that tends to be all that they think about, and that they can no longer enjoy the simple pleasures of life. That ability has essentially been erased from their minds. And so be grateful. Think about what a gift it is that if you're still a simple human being enjoying a meal or enjoying just being in the presence of your loved ones, your pets, that is a gift. And that's a gift that moderation brings. Knowing what is enough and being humble about it, not putting yourself first, not putting your desires first, and being cool with that. There's another line from this chapter, so deep as if existing. How do we know what is real, what is true? In philosophy, we would call that epistemology. And Daoism collapses all that together. The epistemology and ontology get collapsed into one. And the need to have an answer for, is our life real? Is it not? What is real? What is not? Is no longer at issue. And there's a certain freedom that comes along with that, instead of being obsessed with needing an answer, to needing to know. I have to know the truth. So many religions that are quite different in how they approach the world say they have the truth. Well, obviously they can't all have the truth, but it comes from this place of people needing that type of security. And the only way that you can ever have real freedom is to also let go of the need for that type of security. That type of security is an illusion, and it's typically wielded as a weapon. It's weaponized to control people, whether it's a cult or a religious sect or whatever. So this chapter of Daodejing is really important, and that one line says it's so deep, as if it's something, as if it exists, perhaps. Perhaps it does, perhaps it doesn't. We're going to focus on other things and just accept that it's not necessary to have those sorts of answers and still live a full, meaningful life. So before we finish up today, I want to read from a couple of other translations to contrast against the version that I did. I'm going to start with Hall and Ames' Daodejing, Making This Life Significant, a philosophical translation. And I love this one for explaining just the the perspective of Tao in context without having been transmogrified by Western concepts and thoughts. So here's chapter 4 from Hall and Ames. Way-making being empty, you make use of it, but do not fill it up. So abysmally deep, it seems the predecessor of everything that is happening. It blunts the sharp edges and untangles the knots. It softens the glare and brings things together on the same track. So cavernously deep, it only seems to persist. I do not know whose progeny it is. It prefigures the ancestral gods. And now how about Ursula K. Le Guin's? This is a new one that I've started reading based upon the recommendation of another listener. Chapter 4, she titles as Sourceless. The way is empty, used but not used up. Deep, yes. Ancestral to the 10,000 things. Blunting edge, loosing bond, dimming light. The way is the dust of the way. Quiet, yes, and likely to endure. Whose child? Born before the gods. So I love her poetic quality, and there's a lot to like about it. Before the gods, not particularly interested in, again, the transcendent readings that there's gods out there in the universe looking down on us, and I don't think the original writers intended it that way, but that's just my opinion. Last one I'm going to read from Stephen Mitchell, Daodejing, a New English version. The Tao is like a well, used but never used up. It is like the eternal void, filled with infinite possibilities. It is hidden, but always present. I don't know who gave birth to it. It is older than God, capital G. He gets even more transcendent with his interpretation and doesn't translate the middle part. So let's take a look at the character there. Why are they saying gods and God? There's a character, D, and the last 4 characters in this chapter. So those 4 characters, that's where the other translators are saying it came before the gods or before God. Well, D is the word that they're translating as this transcendent being, or in Stephen Mitchell's case, I mean, he does capital G, God, and that's totally a Western introduction, and in my opinion, transmogrification, meaning it distorts it in a kind of gruesome way. D is like emperor in Chinese thought, and it can also have other meanings in modern times, including God, but really what those lines are talking about is like, think of the grandest thing in existence, the grandest position or role, emperor, whatever, and Tao is before even that. It's the predecessor of all manifestations. When the translations start getting bent into talking about there being a capital G God, I think it's unfortunate because it introduces Western concepts that I think are not necessary and do the text an injustice, where we can just focus on this process that we are in right here. Whatever Tao is, it doesn't need to be anywhere else, just here. There's no God out there up in the sky somewhere. That comes from Westerners. This moment, this eternal now, this is the eternal now. If it's heaven and hell in this moment and everything in between, whatever continues forth will be in a moment just like this. There's never going to be the sky god pop out of, the woods or whatever, and hey, it's God, I'm here now. No, Tao is in every moment. Tao is in all things. Tao is in the darkest of darkness, the lightest of light, and everything in between. This eternal dynamic process of water rushing through the gully, water bursting out through the aperture. That's all it is. And isn't that enough?